You want to make the application process as frictionless as possible for the officer, and this is a step that really helps them, because if you have a scheme that's relatively controversial and you get lots of objections, before the officer makes their decision, they have to read all of those objections and then make their own assessment as to the outcome. If you can help them on that journey and actually summarize the objections for them and summarize the reasons why your scheme is acceptable, then that will really help. Now, they're not going to just copy what you say, so it's just to help them, because if you and they'll start to trust you, because if you list the objections accurately and then you respond accurately, fairly, based on the merits of the scheme, then they're going to start trusting you, and then it's going to open up more opportunity for negotiation. If you want to learn more about the planning process and how you can unlock value out of any property, click the link below to learn more. So I wanted to put together a video to help people find ways of negotiating with a planning officer. I know before we get into it, I know that every planning officer is different. Some are super helpful, some are not very helpful, shall we say. I know of cases where someone submitted one application and they were getting nowhere with the officer. They'd done all their research, they thought it was a good scheme, they just couldn't make contact with the officer, and they ended up withdrawing the application. They then submitted the same thing, got a completely different process. They had an officer that was communicating with them all the time, was open to suggestions, and they ended up swimming through the planning process easily by just simply submitting the application at a different time. So I appreciate, before we get into this, there is an element of a lottery about this, but there are some things you can do that will kind of lay the foundation for helping you negotiate with the planning officer. So we'll start going through those. The first one you can do is before you even get anywhere near submitting the planning application, and this is to do your research on previous decisions. You want a kind of good sample size of maybe the last 2 to 3 weeks, maybe even 4 if you can't find schemes of a similar nature to yours. But what you're looking for is, in those decisions, look for ones that are approved, and then once they're approved, have a look to see if there's any superseded drawings. So they'll have drawings that you originally submit with the application. This will be plans, elevations and sections and anything else. But then if the application has been approved and you see that at a later date there have been revisions submitted, then you know that that council is open to negotiation and open to amendments to get the scheme through. A lot of people think that applications are just kind of refused as read or approved as read, but there are actually a few opportunities for you to negotiate and make amendments to the scheme. Now, again, I will caveat this by saying that every council is different, even officers are different, so I appreciate that element, but there are certain things, like I've just said. If you look at the previous decisions, look for superseded drawings, and actually have a look to see at the extent of those changes. So sometimes it can just be the change of, say, a window position or something small like that. But if there are bigger changes made, then that'll give you a good idea as to how good the council are at negotiating, because they will allow some flexibility within the application for you to submit relatively big changes. A word of caution when submitting revisions, though, is that if you want to make changes to a scheme and you think that the council is open to those changes, which is great, if you submit a change that is too great, then just bear in mind that that could be a material change to the application, which could mean that the council will insist on you going out to consultation again, which is another 3-week process. By that I mean, will there be a change to the description of development as a result of your works? Now, for those people that have done that research and they're finding no superseded drawings, then obviously your best bet is to do lots of research up front, so that when you submit your application, you have the best opportunity of getting permission straight away. Because if you do all this research, you're kind of doing the job of the officer before it even gets to them. So that essentially you want the officer just to do a tick box exercise. It meets all the requirements, and then they can just go ahead and approve it. But if you're nervous about that and if you can't find changes to schemes, but you're not sure about your application, you can go down pre-application advice. A word of warning with that is that pre-application advice takes a long time. It's not a quick process. Whilst it can be helpful, it also, in a lot of instances, can be quite unhelpful, because at the end of every pre-application report that you get, so for people that don't know, pre-application advice is something you can go to the council before you submit a formal planning application. You can submit pre-application advice, and they will give you a steer on the scheme that you're doing, and they will say this is acceptable for these reasons. Now, sometimes the pre-application report will be super helpful. It will suggest changes. Sometimes it will just be a policy. It will just say, does this meet policy, yes or no? But the critical bit is at the end of it's either at the beginning or the end, there'll be a line in the pre-application advice that says something along the lines of this is not binding to the council and does not constitute a formal view of that council, which is basically a chance for them to completely change their mind. Now that, for councils, now I've had situations like that. So when I was an officer, when that line is exercised, sometimes it's because there has been a change in officer. So I had a situation where someone was given pre-application advice, a previous officer, that officer left, gave it to me, and the scheme was not acceptable for a few reasons. So I had to go against the pre-application advice, which I appreciate for an applicant is ridiculous. It's a ridiculous situation, and I felt ridiculous doing it as an officer. But when advice is fundamentally wrong, it needs to be changed. It needs to be corrected. Now there are various reasons as to why that happens. Sometimes applications just slip through the net in terms of, so a manager normally reviews every decision or advice that goes out before it's issued back to the applicant. But sometimes things just don't get checked thoroughly because there's just such a workload. So these things can happen. It's not a good thing that happens, but it can happen. So that's what you can do. Check previous decisions, look for superseded drawings, and have a look to the extent of those changes to see what level of negotiation the council's willing to do. If you're nervous that you can't find any changes to drawings and you're really not sure about your stance on the application or the stance of the council will be towards your application, you can go for pre-application advice. It can be very helpful, and it can lead to you getting the same officer once the application is submitted, which can be a good thing. But there is a caveat that if that officer leaves, which is quite common in the planning world, you could get a new officer, and that could change things. Ideally, it shouldn't because everything gets checked, but it can sometimes cause issues. Your best bet is to do your research up front, find out what you believe to be acceptable is, so that when you come to submit your formal application, you're in the best place possible. The other big second tip I would say for getting help negotiating with an officer or negotiating with a council is to submit a very professional application. This is something that is just so overlooked by so many people that submit applications. But what does a professional application look like? Essentially, if your scheme is just drawings, so if you're doing an extension to a house or something that doesn't need any kind of justification in terms of transport or trees or anything, and it's just, say, a rear extension, and it's just drawings, you have to make sure that those drawings are clearly legible. So I would say that you want drawings that can easily be understood by someone who's 12 years old, who can read those drawings and understand it when they're looking at it. Because not only does an officer need to understand it, but also the neighbours need to understand it and the members of the public. And the clearer it is for your application to be understood, and you'll get less objections. But it also means that the officer and the council will have confidence in you that you can submit a good scheme and you're capable of submitting revisions. Because quite often people will submit drawings that aren't clear, and the officer immediately, you see drawings that are incorrect or unclear, and you have no confidence that that applicant knows what they're doing, and the application is already refusable and you have justification for that. So there is no basis for you to then make those changes to those drawings or request changes. But if you have a scheme that's on the margins and you've submitted a very professional application, you've clearly done your research, but it's just a few tweaks that's needed, then you more than likely will have the opportunity to make those amendments. Again, I keep saying it, caveat, every council is different, every officer is different, which is ridiculous, but that's the case. But that is the best thing you can do, is to submit a professional application, and you will give yourself the best opportunity for changes to be requested rather than a decision being made as read. So that's true of drawings, but it's also true of reports. So if you're doing a scheme that obviously includes planning drawings but also requires something like a design and access statement or a transport statement or a tree statement or a sustainability statement, by then you're going to have consultants on board. So your job is then to make sure that all of those reports say the same thing. The key things are Do they refer to the same development? Is the address right? All of those fundamental things, you've got to make sure that those are correct. Because whilst the officer might not read all of those reports in detail, someone with a specialism in those areas will read it. And they essentially have to understand the scheme without having to look at the full application. They just want to read the transport statement or the tree statement to understand it. So you need to make sure that those things are correct. Is the site area right? Is the address right? All of those things. So when it comes to statements, they just need to be making sure they're all singing from the same hymn sheet. The next thing you can do, so if your application is validated, you have an officer, your initial contact with the officer is quite an important next step. So to give you a kind of insight into an officer's life, when a officer requests amendments to things, quite often this is normally reserved for major applications when there's planning consultants involved, but planning officers do sometimes request amendments, but then they get vociferous rejection from the developer, and they come back with chapter and verse as to why that's not acceptable, and it's quite tiring on the officer. But if you make an initial contact with the officer and you ask them if they're willing to accept amendments in order to get the scheme over the line, that will be quite refreshing for an officer, because quite often they are so used to battles with applicants, and that's not just major applications. Officers are battling applicants, neighbours, their own managers, their own colleagues in other departments, councillors. It's a thankless task that planning officers have. If you can make it as friction-free as possible for the officer, then that will really go a long way, because they just want an easy life. An officer has hundreds of applications at any one time, and if you can just make something sail through for them without any issues, without them having to do a lot of work, they're going to respond quite well to that. So the next step is further down the application pipeline. So you've made your initial contact with the officer. The next step is to then make sure that you stay in contact with the officer. I'm not talking daily, because that will end up irritating the officer. But if you stagger it and increase your contacts closer towards the nomination deadline, so start with once a week and then go to twice a week, 3, and then if you haven't heard anything closer to the deadline, then start contacting them more regularly. Again, every officer is different, every council is different, but what you're doing in what those points of contact are, you're asking, is there anything I can do to help to make this work? Have you received any objections that I need to respond to? And you can head that off at the pass. Have a look at the objections that have been submitted for your scheme and start putting together a note that responds to each of those objections, but because the officer has to do that to make their assessment anyway. So make sure that when you do that it's actually true, because quite often people do that and all they're doing is just arguing against why the objection is wrong in a kind of combative manner without actually talking about the merits of their scheme. But if you do this kind of sheet that lists the objection and then lists why your application is fine based on the merits of the scheme and why within the planning merits of the scheme, then that is very, very few people do that, and you'll be amazed how helpful it is. Again, like I've said, you want to make the application process as frictionless as possible for the officer, and this is a step that really, really helps them, because if you have a scheme that's relatively controversial and you get lots of objections, before the officer makes their decision, they have to read all of those objections and then make their own assessment as to the outcome. If you can help them on that journey and actually summarise the objections for them and summarise the reasons why your scheme is acceptable, then that will really help. Now, they're not going to just copy what you say, so it's just to help them, because and they'll start to trust you, because if you list the objections accurately and then you respond accurately, fairly, based on the merits of the scheme, then they're going to start trusting you, and then it's going to open up more opportunity for negotiation. So anything you can do to help them on their journey is something that I would really advise someone to do, because officers are under constant pressure all the time, and if you can help them on that journey to help with their stats, because don't forget their stats are looked at by managers, they're looked at by the central government, so if you can do all these things to help them on their journey, then they're going to be open to negotiation, and they may be then more likely to give you an approval. So one last caveat, one last time, I know every council is different, I know officers can be different, but these steps are things that you can do to make the application process simple for the officer, that could ultimately lead to them being more open to negotiation, to get the application approved within the original application timeline, because you don't want to get You don't want to get an application refused and then spend months at appeal and then you're not actually quite certain about the outcome of that appeal. The goal is to get an approval in the application timeline as quickly as possible, and the best way to do that is to make the job for the officer as simple as possible.